If you ask how many planets there are, you might hear 8 or 9. 8 because you let the International Astronomical Union tell you what is and is not a planet, or 9 planets because that's what people were told as children and are unwilling to change their minds. After all, if they make Pluto a dwarf planet, isn't that just a type of planet? Maybe every rock in the Kuiper Belt is a kind of planet. Moons are just a kind of planet. Suns, just a kind of planet. Maybe it's the only planet, and that all other planets are dwarf planets, with the superplanet Sun as the only true planet. Notice as the number of planets expand from 8 to hundreds to just 1, with nothing actually changing. Mars continues around the Sun indifferent to whether or not it's a planet. Classification is done solely for our benefit. It has no impact on reality. That's fine. Except, what happens when we talk with someone that categorizes things differently? Can you discuss astronomy with someone, even if you can't agree on how many planets there are, or use a different word entirely? Can chefs make anything with a tomato if they can't agree if it's a fruit, a vegetable, or an edible part of a plant without making the distinction between the two? I mean, if a tomato is a fruit, does it belong on a pizza? People fight about these kinds of things, even though it changes nothing. Categories, I mean, not that part about the pineapples on pizza. Well, anyways, is the Bible monotheist? So if you remember from my last video, which is totally different from this one, I gave 2 definitions for monotheism. The worship of a single being, in which every Bible other than the purely theoretical would be monotheist. The second definition, the belief in one God, and then don't define the term, which is fine. It's not like there's no limit to what that term can mean. But it is with that definition that today, at least in English, we see the supernatural world categorized as an all-powerful God, with his angels and opposed by demons. This is considered the way monotheists classify the supernatural world. Then there is the many gods or polytheist classification, in which there are many gods ranging in importance. So would it surprise you to learn that the Old Testament Hebrew classification is closer to the polytheist system? It shouldn't be too much of a shock. It's how their neighbors talked about the supernatural. But what makes the Hebrews different from their neighbors, that of the many gods they could worship, they only worshipped one. At least, that is what they promised. In the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as he introduced himself to Moses, pulled together a people to be his nation. They would be his, and he would not be the only God, but he would be their only God. Think of it as a marriage. When a woman marries a man, her husband does not become the only man, but her only husband. She does not betray him by acknowledging that other men exist somewhere. And for her to say there are no other men besides him, she probably isn't speaking in the most literal of terms. Otherwise, she is not mono-man and is in contradiction with that time she said there were other men that were not her man. Marriage is an apt comparison, as in the Bible, the worship of other gods by his people is compared to adultery, rather than them being confused as to how many gods there are. But we should also recognize that God is an English word, and only shows up in the Bible as a translation. So what words did the Hebrew use to talk about gods? That would be the Hebrew word Elohim. Now, I'm not an expert in biblical Hebrew, on account that I am unable to read Hebrew. But from what I can tell, every supernatural being is an El or an Elohim. The difference between these words is not the difference of masculine or feminine, or anything like that. It's that Elohim is plural. Sometimes. The word Elohim sparks a lot of controversy because it's often translated as God or gods, because it is plural occasionally, depending on the context, like the difference between catching a fish and catching fish. Perhaps the coolest example of multiple Elohim is Psalm 82, in which the singular noun, Elohim, passes judgment on the plural Elohim. With one Elohim against the multitude of Elohim, it is clear that not all Elohim are equal. This is because Elohim isn't a category of species, like the way we often use the term God. It's sort of a generic term for any kind of spiritual being, regardless of power, importance, morality, or allegiance. Perhaps Elohim is better translated as spiritual beings rather than God. I think it's an adequate translation, and having other spiritual beings wouldn't contradict with monotheism. Except, if Elohim does not mean God, then what does? Suddenly there are no gods in the Bible. We just went from countless gods to none. How are we supposed to know if it's monotheistic if the numbers of gods keep changing? And I just can't explain just how much this doesn't matter. Oh wait, yes I can. It was the point of my last video. Using categories just seems unavoidable, but we shouldn't hold to them too fiercely. We should be able to communicate with people even as they use a different set of categories. Someone that believes that God is the only God, and someone who believes God is the greatest of the Elohim might not theologically disagree, only in categories. Their way of doing so may not be better or worse. It's just different. What the Bible does teach, if I may be so bold as to start a sentence this way, is a singular creator who is to be worshipped, that we can call him Lord, Adonai, God, Elohim, the Most High. So long as it's true, then it's fine. Mars is still Mars, whether it's a planet or the only planet. Categories don't change it. It may cause a little confusion, but there's no reason to even keep a consistent classification. We can talk about the one God with angels against demons and false gods, and the greatest of the Elohim or gods, leading his Elohim or gods against the evil gods. Is this a contradiction in categories? A contradiction in language? Yes. Is it a contradiction in meaning? No. So does it matter? Meaning is what matters, not creating a rigid international taxonomy of beings we can't study in a lab. When we are clear on this, then we can talk about how old is the Bible? When did the exclusive worship of the biblical God begin? If it was a gradual or a sudden process, if it was inspired by a different religion, or even if it's true. These are the meaningful subjects. It's just unfortunate that they're tangled in this very dumb, is this monotheist? Counting deities and asking, what is a god? The very worst in meaningless semantics. So, the answer to if the Bible is monotheist is the same as is Pluto a planet? It just depends on what you mean by those categories. The Bible does not need to be monotheist to be true, and believers shouldn't read around the Bible or fret with passages like Exodus 7:1, Psalms 82, or John 10:34. We don't need to defend the Bible as monotheist under every definition of monotheism. That is not a prize worth winning. This is the second video in a series about how monotheism is not a useful term when it's not being unhelpful. I need to take a break from writing about categories on categories. But if you want more information about what I may have hinted at, or only scratched the surface of, There will be links in the description of this video to relevant information by people smarter than me.